So here we are again, and we're continuing to wade our way. Not wade, no, that sounds negative, don't I? Don't mean it like that. But we're working our way through the story of Elijah. And where have we got to? Where have we got to today,
We're
Beryl?
coming to the next exciting episode.
Woo, do.
Last week, we left him having just arrived at Mount Horeb,
Yep.
having had this mammoth trek across the desert.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're moving on today to 1 Kings 19, 9 to 18.
So we arrive at his destination.
Yes, well, I'm going to start in verse 8, actually.
Oh, okay.
It's the link.
Yep.
Oh,
Yes, one of the things I often say to them on a Sunday, on a Wednesday at the Bible study in the evening, is that don't allow the chapter headings to get in the way of the flow. And it often happens, doesn't it? Sometimes they put them in the most inappropriate places.
Well, it does here in NIV because they put it right in the middle of verse 9.
Yes, that's right. Yes, which doesn't make any sense at all, really.
Well, I'm going to read from NIV and then we'll talk about what it says in RSV.
Okay.
And King James, doesn't matter. So Elijah's had this trip across the desert. And from verse 8, he got up, ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he travelled for 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. The word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came, and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel Meholah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." So
Very good.
bit of the ending is quite interesting. We get to that in due course.
Yeah, absolutely.
And part of this passage is very, very familiar to us,
Mm.
not least because of the closing lines of that lovely hymn, "Dear Lord and Father of Mankind."
Yes.
Which is on top 10 list of most people, I think.
Yep.
But we need to put this whole passage into context as the sequel to Elijah's experience as a fugitive. And so we're going to do that in 3 sections.
Okay.
Journey to Horeb, the Mount of God. Then the divine encounter in the cave. And then Elijah's new commission. So he'd been fed and refreshed a second time in the desert by the ministering angel. And then Elijah embarked upon the long journey, about 6 weeks, to the Mount of God known as Horeb. in the Northern Israelite tradition. It was a long journey. I don't know how many, whether it was 300,000 steps,
Yeah, wow.
but a long journey.
Yeah, 6 weeks is a long time. Yeah.
And 6 weeks is used as a sort of device by the biblical writers to signify a long period of time
Yeah.
that was shorter than a year.
Mm.
So they said Horeb was it was the Mount of God, known as Horeb in the Northern Israelite tradition, and as Sinai in the Southern Judaite religion. So this was the very place where God had appeared to Moses at the burning bush. If you want to look at Exodus 3, 1 to 6. You've got lots of things to look at today.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm just warning you.
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mount of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God.
Yeah. And then it was also so that it appeared to Moses there in the burning bush where he got fire again. And later it was the place where the law had been given to Israel, which I'll read from Deuteronomy 4:15. It says, You saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. So there was this tradition in their culture that this sacred mountain was associated with fire in some way.
Yeah.
And then according to Exodus 24:15 and 18, it was also the place where Moses had communed with God for 40 days and 40 nights. But this 40 days business again. And the references in Exodus, and then here in this passage, in 19:11 and 12, 1 Kings 19:11 and 12, suggests that it was probably a volcano, but be that as it may, it was certainly regarded as a sacred mountain in Israelite tradition.
Yeah.
A place where it was possible to meet with God, or as we might say, a thin place.
Yeah.
Probably didn't seem very thin when the volcano was doing its stuff. Now, oddly enough, although Israel's prophets and poets often drew their imagery from the splendors and terrors of that scene, there's no record of any Israelite visiting Horeb, Sinai, from the time the law was given to Moses until Elijah took refuge in the cave there after his flight from Jezebel. Which is quite amazing when you think about it, because it's such a long period of time.
Absolutely. And you would expect it to be, a revered place and a place where they would want to, revisit. So it is interesting.
So all of that begs the question, really, as to why Elijah journeyed across the desert to this sacred mountain. There's some who suggest that the angel instructed him to do so. But there's no evidence to support that. All the angel said to him was, you better eat this because otherwise the journey is going to be too much for you. Didn't say where he was going. So he made it to Horeb, and then he was asked by God what he was doing there.
Yeah.
And that would be illogical if he'd been given a command to do so by the angel. So we can rule out a direct command for Elijah to make his way to Horeb. But having said that, I think it's fair to say he was directed there by the secret providence of God. He was still looking after his servant and bringing him to the point where he could renew himself. So Elijah may have set out on this long journey without any clear idea of where he was going, but God had a plan to renew and restore his servant. And that involved returning to the place where it all began, with the covenant made with Moses. Now, Elijah's actions in taking flight from Jezebel had broken his covenant relationship with God. And although God had not abandoned his servant, as we have seen, the relationship had to be renewed if Elijah were to be restored and fulfill the rest of his mission. So therefore, unaware of the reasons for the route he took, Elijah was guided to Horeb.
Yes, it's interesting. It's interesting, isn't it? The question reminds me of Genesis, where God says to Adam and Eve, where are you? And it wasn't because God didn't know, and I guess the same is true here. It's not that God doesn't know where Elijah is, or why he's there. It's that Elijah doesn't know why he's there, which sort of. In which case the providence of God and the guidance of God wasn't with a deliberate intent on Elijah's perspective, from Elijah's perspective, but it shows God sort of marshalling the circumstances to get him to a place where he has to vocalize really what's causing him distance, what's causing him difficulty. And it's interesting that it happens twice.
Yes, we come to that. So he was guided to Horeb. I mean, fortunately for us, when we find ourselves in Elijah's situation of being out of fellowship with God for whatever reason, we don't have to travel back to the mountain in the Sinai desert to put ourselves right, to renew the covenant relationship. But what happened to Elijah here, as we'll see, was renewal Old Testament style. Whereas we are able to experience renewal New Testament style through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross of Calvary.
And yet the question is still the same, isn't it? It's a question we've all got to face sooner or later. What are you doing here? How on earth did you get into this predicament or this place or this situation or whatever it is? And it's not an easy question to answer, is it? I mean, even in our own personal lives, I remember talking to someone a few years ago, and they were talking about when they were 18. I mean, they were much older than that, but they were going, if you'd have told me at 18 that my life would have taken the twists and turns that it has, I wouldn't have believed it possible. And they were basically saying, here I am at this point in my life, and I sort of don't really understand how I got here, which is this, isn't it? I mean, it's this all over, because it's not that often we make a deliberate and conscious decision to rebel against God and go for it with, hell for leather, as it were. It's the subtle and insidious nature of life that weaves and twists and turns, and suddenly we find ourselves further away than we ever thought we would ever get to. It's so you can sort of understand why God goes, what are you doing here? Because you have to come to terms with the fact that no matter what you intended, you're not in the place that you really wanted.
And isn't that so true?
Oh yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's there's wonderful lessons for us in
yes.
Elijah's story. And he resonates with 21st century really well.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Elijah. Eventually, when he was contented with the distance he put between himself and Jezebel, he found a cave on the mountain where he felt secure enough to lodge for some time. I know it says in the NIV, and this is where I take it issue with their translation. He went into a cave and spent the night. So it sounds as if everything that follows was as soon as he arrived, it happened.
Okay.
However, if you look at what it says in the RSV version.
Oh, okay. It says, and there he came to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him. Okay. Yeah. So the likelihood he was there for some time.
I would think he was.
Mm.
At the end of this trek, he'd found somewhere where he could rest and
Yeah.
and ponder, I suppose. And that the RSV translation is much closer to the Hebrew.
Okay.
We're not told how he passed his time, but I'm sure he would have been reflecting upon his actions, regretting some of it, musing upon his lapse of faith and wondering how he was going to get out of it.
Yes.
And then, still in verse 9, after some time, as he was still lodging in the cave, we read that the word of the Lord came to him. Now we know that God had spoken to Elijah personally on previous occasions with precise instructions. Go back to chapter 17, verses 2 and 3. The word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward and hide in the Kerith ravine. So that was quite specific. He had to do. And then in verse 8 of the same chapter, the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon. Again, really specific. And in 18 verse 1, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab. So in each of those, the word of the Lord came to him, phrase used to introduce the command. But there was a difference here. Can you see it?
Yeah, there's no statement of command here. There's a query as to, position. So
Yeah, it's a conversation takes place. In the other cases, the word of the Lord came to him, God spoke, Elijah went.
Yeah.
But this is quite different. As I say, there's a conversation takes place. I mean, in the other instances, there is no case of Elijah saying to God, but why have I got to go to Kerith? That's not far from where I live. Why can't I go home? Sort of thing.
Yes, there's instant obedience, isn't there? I mean, he
Yeah.
does he all the way through up until this incident. He does exactly what he's told to do, and it works out.
But now, because he's taken it into his own back to go off on this, it's different. And then there's also another difference, which has unfortunately been omitted from the NIV translation.
Okay.
If you can spot it. Okay. Still at the end of verse 9, the word of the Lord came to him. You got it in the
RSV. And then he came to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah?
Okay, this little word, behold, which is there in the Hebrew and translated in, is missed out of the NIV and missed out of quite a lot of modern translations.
Okay.
Probably because the translators thought it was a bit of a tautology and didn't really need it, because the point was the word of the Lord came.
Yep.
But it is actually significant.
Okay.
Because, as I said, the Hebrew for that should be translated, Behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him. Now, you may think it's splitting hairs because it's indicating Elijah was about to have another message from God.
Yeah.
But we need to note a couple of things. The term behold doesn't occur in any of the other passages.
Okay. Yes. 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 Okay. Okay. So in reality, if Elijah had not done his detour, it would have said the word of the Lord came to him, and then it would have skipped effectively to verse 15.
Yeah.
And it would have said, or maybe second half of verse 15, where it says, go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, because it means that in the mind of God, there's sort of no interruption in terms of what the instructions are going to be.
Yeah.
Okay, you've done a bit of a detour, but let's get back on track. But the other interesting thing about that then is that the behold is almost a sort of pastoral thing, isn't it? You know, what's going to come in between the command and this statement, the word of the Lord, is about the rehabilitation of Elijah. It's about the personal, intimate encounter between him and God, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's really interesting, because I mean, behold is basically see, isn't it? It's look and see.
It's very appropriate to say that as I'm changing my glasses.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I'm having trouble with my glasses today. Anyway. Yeah, behold doesn't occur in the other passages.
Yes, no, but that makes perfect sense, really. Because otherwise, I mean, just before you said it, it struck me that that nothing that happens in this part has any bearing, you know, because it was when you said a conversation takes place between Elijah and God. Well, a conversation doesn't take place, not really. God says, what are you doing here, twice, and then tells him what he's supposed to do. But there's no sort of, oh, I'm really sorry you feel like that, or that you're completely wrong, or anything like that at all, really.
That's right.
Because the important thing, and I guess this is what we'll get to, is the important thing is the encounter, isn't it? It's the fact that he encounters God.
Yeah. So this behold, as I say, it's quite significant, and it should alert us to something different is going to happen.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That something extraordinary is going to happen.
Yeah.
And then it goes on after that. I hope I'm in the right glasses now. Sorry. In the RSV one, the one that's closest to the Hebrew. Behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him.
Yeah.
Now we haven't had that again in the other versions.
Yes.
We just assume the word of the Lord, the Spirit.
Yes.
But this phrase, behold, and he said to him, indicates something more than a divine message being communicated.
Yes. Yes.
This was nothing less than a visit from a divine person.
Yes. Yes.
Which the prophet now received. Was it another angel? No.
No, because it personifies the word of the Lord, doesn't it?
That's right. No, it was the word.
Yes. Yes.
And who is the eternal word?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a theophany, isn't it? It's a foreshadowing, a manifestation, appearance of Jesus.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, it's worth noting in passing, and when Peter, James, and John went up to the mountain with Jesus and witnessed his transfiguration, they also saw Moses
and Elijah
talking with him. And here in this passage, in this little verse, we have a mountain forever associated with Moses, the lawgiver. We have Elijah, the prophet in the cave.
Yeah, very interesting.
And we have the word conversing with him.
Yeah, interesting.
I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and to be honest with you, if you hadn't pointed it out, I'd have completely missed it.
Yeah, well, I missed it many times.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Mm.
But then when you see it, you
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like,
And
wow,
again,
sharp focus.
it's one of those things, isn't it? I mean, when we were looking at Ephesians, I was saying to them on a Wednesday that it's really important that you look at every word, that you don't just sweep over stuff, because the Pauline epistles are are concentrated down. I mean, just incredibly concentrated. And of course, when we came to the Book of Acts, they expected it to be the same, and because it's a different genre, it's not the same. And and that is really challenging. But yeah, no, good, yeah, very good.
So we've got this foreshadowing, really, of the
Mm,
transfiguration.
mm.
And then we come to the question that Elijah was asked.
Yeah.
What are you doing here, Elijah? The inference of the question alters slightly depending which word is accentuated.
Yes, yeah.
You
That's the
could
trouble
say,
with reading. Sometimes you don't know what the accent was or
no,
where the emphasis was placed. Yeah.
what are you doing here?
Mm.
That's my best teacher voice from when I was on playground teaching. Like, what are you doing here? Or what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Or what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Or what are you doing here?
Yes.
It could be any of those. It could be all of those.
Yeah.
But it was certainly a challenging question to Elijah.
Mm.
And in a way, the question was a rebuke to him, a searching word addressed to his conscience.
Yes. Yes, and they always are, aren't they? I mean, I've just remembered God's question to Jonah. Why are you angry? Well, he doesn't say that. He says, "You're very angry, aren't you?" And it's not because God doesn't know. Again, it's because Jonah has to come to terms with his own anger and the stupidity, in one sense, the folly of his anger. And there's a sense in which that's true here, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's interesting.
Look what's happened. You sent me to Nineveh, and look what's happened. They repented.
I knew it. I knew that's what you were going to do. Why did you bother sending me? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And but here it's sort of it's confronting Elijah with his with his true condition, really, isn't it? With his true situation. And yeah.
I mean, in other words, we could say that the question really could be paraphrased, I suppose, as how are you spending your time?
Yes, yes.
Are you using it for the glory of God and the good of his people?
Yeah.
Or are you wasting it in peevish musings and repining?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Or it could be, look at you, the servant of the Most High God, who's known his favor and been honored by him. And yet here you are, living like a hermit.
Yeah.
And not reflecting the many blessings he showered upon you.
Yeah.
Or why are you skulking here in the mountain cave, many miles away from the land of Israel, and your task of reformation? What are you doing here?
Yeah.
So how does Elijah respond?
Yeah, before we get onto that, one of the things I always find really interesting in the Old Testament is the economy of language that God uses. You see it again and again and again, don't you? I mean, you get David, for example, when he sort of pours out his heart to God and God goes, do it. Or, it's sort of, oh, okay. And the answer doesn't always fit the question, and here we've got the question and the answer doesn't fit. And that's really interesting. But I find it fascinating. Often we think that if we speak to God, we should have, quite a long conversation. There should be quite a lot coming from God's side, and there isn't. And we wonder why that is. And God tends to use this economy of language. So I find that really interesting. The thing that fascinates me, and I have to say, it's one of the things that fascinates me most about this passage, is Elijah's response, because it's almost like he's playing the tape in his head. You know, we do this, don't we? We formulate an excuse, an explanation, you know, why am I feeling like this, and in our heads. And it's almost like you could read it that he's justifying himself, or you could read it that this is the thing that he cannot get round and get over.
Yeah.
And you get that feeling, don't you? You know, there's a bit of poor old me about it. You know, I've been very zealous.
Been very zealous.
Yeah, and he sort of, that in and of itself, he sort of misses the point, doesn't he? He sort of misses, you know, he's focused upon himself. He's focused on how he's feeling and his predicament and situation. And the minute you do that, you miss the point. You miss what's going on.
Yeah.
So I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. I don't get the impression that the emphasis is upon the Lord God Almighty at this moment.
No, it's on him. I've been zealous.
You know, and the Israelites have rejected the covenant. Well, actually, that may be the case, but considerable ground has been, you know, Mount Carmel, considerable ground has been won and accomplished.
Yeah.
You know, we already know that he's not the only one left because Obadiah told him so.
Yeah.
So he's feeling extremely sorry for himself and isolated and, you know, and fearful. So you get this sort of expression of all this emotion.
Yeah.
So it's very raw.
Oh, it is raw.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of seeking to excuse himself and throw the blame on others.
Yes, absolutely.
Although actually what he did say was a frank and candid explanation of his conduct. But it's still focusing on him, as you say.
Yes.
And it's oh, for me, he'd not shrunk from the difficult and dangerous service for God and his people. He'd been deeply distressed to see how badly God had been dishonoured by the nation as a whole. God's authority had been flouted, his worship despised. Homage of the people had been given to Baal and other false gods. And we know Elijah had toiled hard and long to stop Israel's idolatry. But here he is, as you say, in the cave, feeling sorry for himself, seeming that he laboured in vain and spent his strength for nothing. So in fact, what we could say, he'd lost his sense of perspective.
Yes. Oh yeah, totally.
And it's so easy to do that, particularly when he's isolated himself. This wasn't the isolation that he had in the Kerith ravine at God's command, but this was his choice to isolate himself.
Yes.
And, you know, you could imagine him sort of running over in his mind the things that had happened and woe is me, you know.
No, yeah.
I am the only one left. Totally lost his perspective.
And it's easy to do that, isn't it? It's easy to do that when, you know, when Christianity, for example, is in the ascendancy, you know, and in many respects in this country, that has been the case for a good few hundred years. And then you find yourself in a situation where the church is in decline and you are a minority voice. It is very easy to lose perspective. It's very easy to think that all you can expect to do is to maintain the status quo, you know, at least don't lose those you've got. And you can see it in our own day that we've sort of, there's a growing lack of confidence in God. You know, and that's exactly where Elijah finds himself here, really. I mean, he falls short of actually doing what Adam did, you know, the woman that you gave me. He doesn't turn around and go, and it's all your fault. But yeah, but it's the shift of focus. It leaves him in a sorry place, doesn't it?
Yeah. So having offered up this account of what he had been doing, which was accurate, Elijah was then called upon to witness this remarkable or inspiring
Yep.
display of God's power. And if we go back to Exodus again,
Yep.
Chapter 19.
Yep.
And verses 16 to 18.
Yep. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. When Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Whoa. Woo!
Ooh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't get the impression that there was any whispering on that day.
No, and there wasn't to start with here either.
Yeah,
This
no,
time.
that's right. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? It's interesting in our passage that there's no, God does not address in many respects his issues. He doesn't go, into a long conversation about, well, that isn't the case, and because of this and this and this, and and there's no reasoning with Elijah here. There's he allows him to vent, to just sort of spew it out, because it's better out than in, and then he moves to what he really needs, which is this new vision, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting, which is why I said that this is no conversation, because very little conversation actually takes place.
Yeah.
Because that's not what he needs. In one sense, he needs a confrontation. He needs to encounter God and see God in a new light.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
So in other words, what God was demonstrating to Elijah in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, they all combined really as a wordless object lesson of God's power and might. Now Elijah knew that God was powerful and mighty. He'd experienced it.
Yeah.
But he's also suffering from selective memory.
Yes. Yeah.
But God wanted Elijah to see that his power was present and available to the prophet.
Yes.
But the fact that he was not found in the devastating forces suggests that God's plan for turning his people back to obedience would not be achieved through destructive power.
Yes.
Such as possibly killing Jezebel, for example.
Yeah, or the prophets of Baal, quite honestly.
Right. The few that were left, because he killed 800 of them.
Yeah.
But what he wanted to demonstrate to Elijah, that his power and might was available, but by the quieter, persuasive power of Elijah's faithful obedience to God.
Yes. And I mean, one of my sort of favorite phrases, I guess, is you cannot grab somebody by the lapels and go, you will love me, because love doesn't work that way. So to a certain extent, Elijah had hoped that the fire falling would lead to wholesale revival and a complete return to, and I guess the people throwing Jezebel out and Ahab out, and of course that didn't happen. And there's almost an attestation here, isn't there, that God is saying, and it ain't going to happen that way.
That's right.
That is not according to my plan and purpose. My plan and purpose is...
I got all this power, I've just shown you, but that's not what's...
Yes, absolutely. And it's also, there's almost a sort of New Testament revelation here, isn't there? Because Elijah is being invited into an intimacy that you don't get any sense of in the chapters we've seen so far. There's this God who's is competing and overruling Baal, who is great and mighty. In fact, he says it here, doesn't he? The Lord God Almighty. you know, he doesn't call him, you know, the Lord as in the just as in the covenant keeping God. He has to be a mighty God. And God's going, actually, but you can be mighty in gentleness, really. You know, he's revealing something new about himself that I think Elijah's not seen before.
But he hasn't, has he?
No. Yeah.
So despite displaying his power and might, God chose to speak to Elijah in a still small voice.
Yeah.
Or as NIV puts it, a gentle whisper. And I'm going to give a plus point to NIV there, because I think that's much more powerful image.
Yes.
A gentle whisper.
Mm.
And that was designed to calm Elijah down and soothe his ruffled and troubled spirit. If you've been in turmoil such as Elijah had been, and then seen all this, well, volcanic eruption, for want of a better term, but seen the power and the might, you would have been troubled. And if he was going to move forward, that inner turmoil and feeling had to be calmed down. Now, when God finally spoke in the whisper, I wonder what it was he said.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
There isn't an answer to that question, but it's worth pondering.
Yes, it's a bit like Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. Everybody gets fixated on what he wrote. When he wrote with his finger in the sand. And we're not told that either, which is really annoying. But yeah.
So whatever was said, it was the gentle whisper that moved Elijah to respond to God's grace by going out of the cave and hiding his face in his cloak as a sign both of his reverence for the majesty of God and of his own unworthiness.
Yes, there's a humility, isn't there?
Yeah, like at last we're making some progress.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and you get the impression, you know, that whilst the first explanation as to why he's there could be quite defensive, you know, and quite, boom, this is the way, here it's a more gentle and humble, you know, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. And, you know, I find it quite touching that actually it's said twice, because so often in the therapeutic process of our healing, it doesn't all happen overnight, and it doesn't all happen instantaneously. I mean, sometimes it does, but because actually many of our difficulties are not to do with external symptoms, they're to do with internal conflicts. And they are much more difficult to actually reconcile. And there's a reconciliation going on here. There's a putting back together that's going on here, isn't there?
Yes. Yeah.
It reminds me of, you know, do you love me more than these, with Peter, you know, and the 3 times.
Yeah.
You know, and Peter's humble response.
Yeah. Yes, there is a real parallel with Peter.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Moses has hidden his face when he encountered God in the burning bush. And similarly, when he stood before God on the same mountain that we're on now to renew the covenant, again, he was hidden in a cleft of the rock.
Yes.
As the glory of God passed by.
Yeah.
And so Elijah was in the same frame of mind now as Moses had been. And it wasn't all the rumblings of the mountain and all of that. It was the gentle whisper.
Yes. Yes, but there's a difference, isn't there? Because in that instance, Moses says, "Now show me your glory."
Yeah.
And you get the impression he's sort of pushing his luck, really. You know, God's already said, I won't leave you, I will go with you, you know, and I won't abandon these people, and I won't exterminate all of them. And Moses goes, yeah, but I want intimacy. But here, God is effectively going, I'm going to show you something. I'm
Yeah.
going to show you myself. And there is, often in the Old Testament, when it talks about the word of the Lord, it's often not about hearing the word of the Lord, it's about seeing the word of the Lord, which is really quite interesting. Yeah.
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 But it was in Elijah's response to God's gentle whisper that the relationship was restored.
Yes. And actually what he gets, doesn't he, in verse 15 onwards, is almost a reassurance that God will put to right that which Elijah has assessed as being completely wrong.
Yeah.
And that the situation is not going to be left for a long time. I mean, bearing in mind that, this whole experience of Elijah it was at least 3.5, 4 years old by now. That first encounter and that first instruction. And you can imagine him thinking, will this ever change? We've gone this far and it's still no closer to the end, that it seems, than it was at the beginning. And there's an incredible graciousness, isn't there, that the Lord includes him in the solution, not just in the defense against the problem, because of what he then goes on to tell him to do. And yet he's also saying to him, isn't he, that I've got this, I will sort this. And that must be incredibly reassuring to Elijah.
The kindness and tenderness of God was evident.
Yes, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Which enabled Elijah to overcome his disappointment, cheer his heart and restore his soul.
Yeah.
And thus equipped, he was ready to face fresh challenges and tackle any tasks that God might assign him. Then we come to the last part. So no sooner had Elijah made his response to God's gentle whisper than the question is repeated. What are you doing here, Elijah? Isn't the still small voice the gentle whisper? Presumably this was the word once more. It's not a mistake and it's not mere repetition, but rather the repeated question was more a case of, why are you still here?
Yeah. Yes.
The conversation had taken place, the scenario had played out, and now it was time to move on. I put it right. Our relationship is restored. What are you doing still here? Get on with it.
Yeah.
And so verses 15 to the end, he's commanded to go back the way he had come.
Yes.
I.e. via the Arabian desert and the Negev, and go to the wilderness, the desert of Damascus, the area between Israel and Syria, to the north and east of Gilead, Elijah's homeland. So really, he was sent back home.
Yes. But it is interesting, isn't it? It's interesting that God says to him, go back the way you came.
Yes.
And there's always got to be, for us, no matter how far we've fallen, drifted, found ourselves where we didn't expect to be, that you don't go on without going back. It's repentance, isn't it? And this for him is the positive side of repentance.
Yeah. So he was sent back home.
Yeah.
Where he'd first been called by God to prophetic ministry. We don't have a record of when that happened.
No.
But he was given a new commission, indicating he had indeed been renewed and restored, which, as you said a few minutes ago, was so reminiscent of what happened with Peter.
Yes, yes. But there's also this, he's invited into prophetic symbolism here, isn't he? Because whilst he's got something practical to do, he's got to anoint these two kings, and he's got to anoint his successor. It's almost God saying, these are the guys who are going to effectively sort this out. And whilst it may take some time, you are going to prophetically anoint them for what they're going to become.
Yeah.
And that's that in and of itself is quite well. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
How would that have encouraged Elijah, the fact that God had given him work to do?
It's one of those things, it's interesting when people are depressed, isn't it? That the least little things, just concentrate on getting out of bed in the morning. But often it's being given something to do that gives it starts to turn the corner. And I guess it's, there's no sense here of God. Well, it's from God's perspective, it's business as usual. I mean, okay, you've had a bit of a wobble, but this was the next thing I was going to ask you to do, and now I'm asking you to do it. He's not going, and it's quite important, this, isn't it? Because often you can read Elijah and think, well, Elijah's was a failed ministry ultimately, and it isn't until you get to Elisha that things start to, get sorted, because he does what Elijah doesn't do. But that's not what's going on here, because he obviously continues his ministry, anoints Hazael and Jehu and Elisha, etc. It must have been reassuring to Elijah that he hadn't completely messed up, such that God goes, well, I can't use you anymore.
That's right. You're unreliable.
Well, yes, exactly. Yeah. I can't trust you with, my, cosmic dealings or. Yeah.
It gave Elijah a renewed sense of purpose and value, and the knowledge that God was not yet finished with him.
Yes. And from this moment on, our encounters with Elijah become much more personal and much more intimate. You almost get the feeling that there's a softening, and a relaxing that goes on in Elijah that wasn't there before. And you can understand that. I mean, up until this point, it's been pretty harsh, to be honest. It's been tough. But from this moment on, you get these intimate scenes, don't you? You get this intimate scene in terms of his relationship with Elisha, and all sorts of things begin to happen that are very personal. And he comes off the mountain, I would venture to suggest, a changed person, a different person to the person who was on Mount Carmel, or a different person to the one who got to the mountain in the first place.
Yeah.
Transformation takes place.
I think, it's also interesting, isn't it, that after he's recommissioned him, he's given him specific jobs to do. We go home first. Verse 18 is almost like a postscript to it.
Yes.
And yet it's not.
No, it isn't. No.
I reserve 7,000 in Israel.
Yeah.
All whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him.
Yeah.
So it's reassurance that
massively, you are not alone, Elijah.
That's right. You're not alone, and also that your mission hasn't failed.
No. Yes, and in fact, those who are for me are more than those who are effectively against me. You've killed 800 of their prophets. We are now back in the black in a way.
That's right. That's all really I need to do on this today.
Yeah, but no, it's
passage.
It is interesting. I mean, it is a really, really humbling passage in many respects, because it speaks of a transition in the life of Elijah, and you catch glimpses of not just the word of the Lord made flesh, but the qualities that most people don't actually see in the Old Testament. This gentleness, this tenderness, this invitation into intimacy. It's all there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Wow.